everyone, and welcome back to Pantheon Plus. My name is Jerome Q-San. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. Last month, we honored Academy Award-winning actress Michelle Yeoh. This month, we will be taking a look at Donnie Yen, specifically looking at his Yip Man franchise. You can follow us on Twitter at Hero Pantheon. Please make sure you leave a 4 or 5 star review so as to help people discover the great work that we are doing here at Pantheon Plus. And you can check out what the real world is doing as well. My co-host for this week and every week is Brian at Brian to Brain on Twitter. And Brian, at the end of tonight's episode, we're going to discuss some of our preliminary plans for the rest of the year. But I know, Brian, that coming off of watching some great Michelle Yeoh movies, we saw Donnie Yen at the Academy Awards. We saw Donnie Yen in John Wick 4. I know that you had to come into this really excited because I know that, we've seen him in kind of these ancillary roles, the Rogue Ones, the Blade 2s, and he's kind of been off to the side, but both you and I have been very curious to see what's it like to see Donnie Yen in a lead role. And this franchise is a very good pretext to talk about Donnie Yen because of the fact that there is so much great action in these movies. And Brian, I know that you had to come into this very excited.
Yeah, I've been wanting to watch these movies for a long time, long time, because I remember this was during my Blockbuster days, like the first two movies. So those two movies were very popular rentals at the time, and I remember a lot of people trying to recommend it to me. I just never got a chance to watch it. But finally, Jerome proposed the month because he had that special coupon that he had, and he bought all the movies a while back. So we kind of decided, okay, let's put it together for the month of May. And I'm glad I waited to binge this together, like back to back to back, all fresh. I didn't really read any spoilers at all. I just kind of went kind of fresh. And all I knew that was that Yeet Man is like, the Grandmaster of Wing Chun, and then he ended up teaching Bruce Lee. So it's this kind of like almost like, we're doing the whole prequel thing to the Bruce Lee career, where like Bruce Lee's career is like 4, 5, and 6 of Star Wars, and this is going to be like 1, 2, 3 of the Yeet Man story and legacy. So it was pretty cool to see. Going all the way back to 1935, there's some really, like, I don't know, weird time travel issues going on here in this series, but we'll talk about that later on. But other than that, if you kind of put that behind you, it's a really fun action series. I think you put it best, Jerome, when we were texting. Like, the action in these movies tends to escalate and escalate and escalate as the fights go on. And I think that's really, like, it really is an effective way to elevate the action to the point where it climaxes at the right time. And especially in this first movie, it works really well. And I think the only thing that kind of threw me off was the colors, and we'll talk about that in terms of the technical stuff later. But I really enjoyed it. I love the Eat Man theme now. I can't wait to play that on loop as I play video games or do a project or whatever. But yeah, this whole franchise has got me excited. Sammo Hung, shout out to Sammo Hung, the legendary action choreographer, comedy action star in Hong Kong. He was the choreographer for this movie and the next. He's also a star in the next movie as well. But this is clearly a Sammo Hung choreographed style of fighting in this movie. It's so good and it's so great. I shout out to Sammo Hung because I think he's an unsung hero in a lot of these movies we reviewed, because he's been a lot of the stunt coordinators in a lot of them. So shout out to Sammo Hung.
Absolutely, and we can get into him a little bit more next week. But Yip Man is a real person, so we have to put that into context. This is probably the first time we're doing a biopic in our time podcasting together, which is pretty incredible. I think the only other biopic we've really done is 42, right? With when we did Chadwick Boseman, I think.
Yeah, that's the only one I can think of, and that wasn't even like a total cover of his whole life.
Correct. So basically, we're doing 4 biopics. But the thing about this series is, you should not come into this series with the understanding that they are giving us an accurate portrayal of who he is. The way I think you have to watch these movies is that, yes, there are aspects of the truth, certainly, and maybe they are in some ways capturing the spirit of who he is as a person. But I think when you watch this movie and the subsequent sequels, I think you almost have to look at them as these are like myths, they're tall tales. They are kind of legends of somebody's life. Do not treat this as the truth. The truth is that Ip Man is the mentor to Bruce Lee, and that is probably the most important thing. And this is not a history podcast, so I am not going to sit here and correct the record every time they do something wrong. But there are a couple of aspects that I'm going to point out when the movie when the movie itself diverts from the truth. I'm going to try to point out maybe some of the accuracy involved, but just understand again that this is not a history podcast, and that is not where our focus is going to be.
Yeah, because I mean, I totally forgot some of the history of World War II, and this kind of reminded me of that. And I was like, oh shit, I totally forgot about like this totally different aspect of the war where, Japan was kind of like, trying to conquer China pretty much. And yeah, they invaded for like 7 or 8 years and they finally left the occupation. But I totally forgot about that whole aspect of World War II. So yeah.
Well, I think it is very undertaught. And one thing I will say is, so I went to Hong Kong in 2017. I spent a weekend there when I was living in China. So I went to a history museum in Hong Kong, and it was a fascinating experience. Hong Kong is a very fascinating place because it is considered to be a quote unquote special territory because it is of course not mainland China, but it has an unusual history in the fact that it was territory quote unquote owned by the United Kingdom until 1997. So there are many aspects of the country that feel very European, and there are many aspects of the country that feel very a little bit more Easternized, I would say, that feel more Asian, Chinese, what have you. So in going to this museum, I think anytime you're talking about World War II, it feels like you're going over very familiar territory with the Holocaust and some of the Pacific theater with Pearl Harbor and the atomic bombs. But I think what people don't really appreciate is just how awful Japan was in conquering Hong Kong and mainland China. And obviously, this film gets into a little bit of that. From a nationalistic perspective, I would say this movie is obviously very pro-China, and again, that it's very, very complicated to talk about. But again, if you are a fan of movies like RRR and Top Gun, then you really can't criticize this movie for being nationalistic, because those two movies are also extremely nationalistic in tone. And to an extent, it is propaganda, but I think you either accept that or you don't, and you have every right to not accept it. But just understand that that's kind of what you're getting here. So in visiting the museum, I mean, you get to see just this very different perspective on World War II, because I think from the Americans' perspective, I think the way that we are taught World War II is that we basically saved the world from being conquered by Germany and Japan, like because we weren't being invaded, and our soldiers were going in and saving the day, so to speak. And while there is certainly some truth to that, that kind of hides the fact that there were horrific things going on in Hong Kong and China from the Japanese Empire at that point. And I think that this movie, again, gets into some of that. But if you have a chance to read up on some of the tragedies and some of the horrendous treatments, I would strongly recommend doing so, because it is a part of this war that we don't really talk about. And I think that because it's Asia and because it's not Europe, I think that can very easily get erased. But it was fascinating, and I spent a lot of time in the museum reading that, because again, it's a part of like this event that we all know so very well, but this was a very different perspective.
Yeah, and because I forget too that like the Philippines were under occupation for like 3 years as well in the 1940s. So it's just really interesting because we don't really see a lot of films about that, and I don't know if it's just because there's maybe more films outside of the United States that talk about that, but don't really cover it here in the U.S. because we have that U.S. perspective. But it'd be really interesting if there's something out there. I don't know if someone would recommend it to us or whatnot, but that other perspective of World War II. But yeah, because when I was watching this, it kind of threw me off because I completely forgot about it. You know what I mean? And I took AP Euro and AP US History, so we talked about World War II a lot in those 2 years, obviously. And you kind of forget about that aspect of it. And then when it happened in the movie, I was like, oh shit, completely forgot this was going to happen. You know what I mean? It's like 1935. But it's really depressing. But I like how they don't go into so many details about, like necessarily the politics of it all. It's very generalized. It's more about they just came in and occupied. There's no necessarily an explanation as to why Japan came in and occupied their country or whatever. And they kind of gloss over it as an event, as a, as just an event that happens to them and their response to it. So they didn't really get into the details, the dirty details, I should say, or the politics of it all. So I think that was kind of the safe move to do because again, this is an action movie, but within the context of the story they're trying to tell, they have to tell this part of the story because it did feel like it was kind of like, oh, this kind of threw me off because the first act is completely different, and like the first act is before the occupation, and it kind of threw me off as to what this, I was like, oh shit, did the first act kind of just not have any meaning, and then this whole second act is gonna be completely different, but it actually all connected in the end. It just like completely threw me off. But again, that's kind of like I feel like the writing was a little off in this movie compared to the next movie, but I think in this movie they tried to put a little too much story into it. But I think there was just so many events that took place in this time period that they had to cram it into an hour and 45 minutes.
Yeah, that's the thing about these movies is all four of them are roughly the same amount of length in terms of movie, which I give it a lot of credit for. And I think the first two movies feel very different from each other. I think this movie feels much more connected to history in a lot of ways. Again, even though there are some inaccuracies, I think this movie is more connected to history, and I think there is a much more clear theme in a lot of ways. I think what you're getting with this movie is you're getting this theme of honor is the most important thing. And in Southeastern Asian culture, saving face is a huge part of living in places like mainland China and in Japan. Saving face, having honor, those are really big deals. And I think this movie does a very good job of illustrating that. I would say that that is one of its greatest strengths, in fact, is the fact that above all else, Yip Man, even though he does fight, I feel like he only fights when when his honor is being challenged, or if he's defending the honor of his country, or if he's defending the honor of his family. And like he even says, I mean, there are multiple instances of characters when they are offered food, they're like, screw the food. I want to protect my honor. That is what is most important to me. So from a thematic standpoint, I think that's one of the reasons that I really like the first one. And again, there are nationalistic tones. So don't think that that doesn't exist, but I really do appreciate, and you don't get that in American movies as much, but this idea of honor is something that I think is a real strength of this first one, especially.
Yeah, and that's kind of like a lot of theme or the running theme in a lot of these like movies like this. I mean, immediately you think of Mulan, right? Because I mean, there's a song about it and they talk about it a lot, but it really is a very important aspect of that culture. There was a movie called Saving Face. I think I watched it like 20 years ago at this point, but yeah, I think it's kind of like a borderline comedy drama. But if you want to check that out, it's kind of like a an American look into that, I guess, even though it's a foreign film. But uh, yeah, God, that was 20 years ago. But that this idea of saving face, I mean, it's really true because I don't think at any point in this, I don't know, the first movie, I mean, at least in this movie, I don't think he like or I don't know, maybe he does laugh, but not in like breaking character kind of way. He's very stoic, like to the point where I'm like, he's holding back tears at some point, but it's like he's holding it back. You know what I mean? And it's like, okay, this dude's trying to be like the stoic dude, but he's a badass. But he doesn't want to like admit that he's a badass, so he's humble about it. Which I think that's what really works for me, is that he's humble about his skills, and I really appreciate that because I think anytime you got a humble hero, it's a kind of a charm kind of thing that adds to the character, and he's definitely got that charm with him when he's very humble about what he can do, to the point where like in this movie. He doesn't even want to open up a school, and in the later movies, it's all about him in the school. So it shows you the character that he was in 1935 and the transition he goes through the occupation and all that stuff. Because I mean, he does come from wealth, so I mean, that adds a little to it. Because I mean, a different perspective on life. Maybe just being comfortable for most of his life at that point kind of just made him into this person, and that person is the one that's going to influence all these other people. So sometimes it's just something like that can influence a whole culture. It may not just be like a poor person that can influence the whole culture. Sometimes it can be actually like a person from wealth, and in this case, it is with Eat Man. So I found that kind of fascinating as well. That this guy kind of came from wealth, and became an influence on the whole country that is, I don't know, that's dealing with a lot of issues in terms of poor, especially during the occupation. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
For sure. So there were a number of attempts at making a Ip Man movie, and there are a number of other versions of his story that are out there, including one called The Grand Master by Wong Kar-wai. And at one point, there was a dispute about who was going to be able to make it. And I guess basically what happened is you ended up with these multiple versions, and there are other versions made by other directors as well. I will say I have watched that particular version, and as much as I love some of Wong Kar-wai's work, The Grandmaster is not very good. And despite the fact that you have Tony Leung playing the titular character, I think it's a pretty big disappointment. And it doesn't work nearly as well. I think look, Tony Leung is an incredible performer. In terms of acting, I would say he is a million times better than Donnie Yen. But I think in terms of this particular role, Donnie Yen is definitely the more appropriate person. So, as mentioned in the film, the Ip Man's fighting style is Wing Chun. So our reviewing that movie last week was not a coincidence. It was a really good transition point because Wing Chun is not just a person, but it is a fighting style. And according to the legend, a warlord wanted to marry the aforementioned Wing Chun, but she refused and instead challenged him to a duel. She came across a Buddhist nun whom she asked for help. They created this art of Wing Chun, and then Wing Chun won the fight. So this is all kind of legend and part of history. So that is kind of the origins of the Wing Chun fighting style. A couple of historical notes that I again do want to point out. Apparently, Grandmaster Ip Man was employed as a police officer during the Japanese invasion. Not many other details are provided, but I thought that was an interesting note. There is also a specific incident referred to as the Marco Polo Bridge incident. In 1931, Japan invaded and occupied Manchuria, resulting in a tremendous upwelling in anti-Japanese sentiment. By 1937, the Chinese communists and nationalists agreed to hold their civil war and joined together to oppose Japan. 1937, the Japanese occupied a railway station near the Marco Polo Bridge, which was one of the entryways into Beijing. They were conducting maneuvers. One night, the Japanese demanded entry into a small town. When searching for a soldier who was away without leave, a confrontation ensued. Shots were fired. China refused to concede, and things accelerated from there. And that is how the Pacific version of World War II theater kind of began. The Japanese cracked down on Chinese resistance and became rather aggressive. So just an interesting note there. So at the end of the movie, we're going to get into like how the movie itself ends, but it is worth noting that that the idea is that Japan did surrender in August 1945. The movie says that China had a lot to do with it, and it didn't. China really did not defeat or even have a unified government to fight against Japan. Because there were communists, there was the military, there were numerous warlords. A lot of the reason the war ended was because of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as Stalin declaring war. Those are the main reasons that there was an unconditional surrender to General MacArthur and the United States. There was a lot of oppression, so it should be clear that even though China maybe did not have could not claim victory necessarily, it is very much worth noting that they went through an incredible amount of suffering at the hands of Japan. And I think that is represented pretty accurately in this movie.
I would say so. Other than like his kid not aging and his wife not aging as well. We'll talk about that in a little bit.
Right. I was gonna mention that his kid is portrayed as being 4 or 5 years old, but in reality he was a preteen basically at this time.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. And yeah, that whole little history lesson there was like, oh man, I was having flashbacks to history class in my U.S. history class. But yeah, it's a fascinating time because I'm more appreciative of like World War II movies than I am Vietnam War movies. So, I mean, I think I would recommend the Clint Eastwood movie, not Flags of Our Fathers, Letters from Iwo Jima. I think that's a good perspective as well for World War II and the alternate perspective. I think Clint Eastwood actually did a good job with that one. But yeah, historically, I think they got it right. But I think it, of course, I think what they did, of course, was like make these like evil, like bad guys out of them, like, and they kind of just troped them and stereotyped them. So that was going on. But again, it was very general. Like a lot of the detail we just gave you is not in the movie at all. It's like kind of off mentioned, but it doesn't provide like a historical background to what's going on and this occupation and the build up to the fights at the end. But yeah, I think, excuse me, I think what they did in terms of providing that background was a good idea. Uh, so yeah, I think yeah. The only thing I think that bothered me a little bit again was just like the time jumping, and then I don't know if that was. I want to assume that the translation we got in the credits or like in the writing and stuff like that was accurate, but it could be, I don't know, because sometimes translations don't translate well, so maybe it looked like China provided more help in World War II than they provided in the context, but I don't want to assume that kind of thing, but you never know with the translations these days.
Well, again, I would say that that this movie is pretty nationalistic, and again, that is both. It is not completely an insult, but it is a definite critique. But I would say that look, there are not a lot of nationalistic movies that the United States makes as well, and I mean, even the Marvel movies have clear. Even the people at Marvel have a clear relationship with the United States military. So this is a reality that is worth pointing out. So let's get into the movie itself. So I think part of what makes these first two movies similar is that the first 30 to 40 minutes in some ways are kind of a prologue. They are not necessarily actual plot being delivered, but there's a lot of setup going on, some explanation about what's going on at this current time. And in 1935, we are in the town of Foshan, which is a hub of Southern Chinese martial arts. There are a number of schools that are competing against each other, and Yip Man is kind of the most skilled martial artist in town, but the only way that he really fights is behind closed doors to preserve both the privacy of the other masters, but also, again, so they are allowed to maintain their honor. So we get a troublemaker named Yuan, and he is losing his kite. This kite lands in a tree in the family's backyard, and of course, he just happens to see Yip Man defeating a fellow kung fu master, Liu, in a sparring match, and they both wanted to keep it a secret, but Yuan unwittingly spreads the story throughout town and causing dishonor for Liu. Yuan's brother Lin, a restaurant owner and disciple of Liu, publicly embarrasses Yuan as he tries to arrange a rematch between the two, and it's a really interesting setup because, again, this is about preserving the honor, and even though there is a competition between these various groups, there's also a lot of respect as well. So that's kind of what this prologue is establishing, is the level of respect for these groups.
Yeah, and it's this reputation. You know what I mean? It's all about reputation, and that kung fu master that lost in the beginning of the movie, he's pretty much worried about his reputation, and that's kind of what it's like tipping him off or like setting him off because like this thing that's going around is going to ruin his school. And he's going to lose students and he's going to lose his school, and that's kind of where it's at. And I thought that was a good perspective at all because I was thinking the same thing too. Like if this goes around, he's going to lose his reputation, and all of a sudden the next scene you see him just kind of like, oh shit, like he bolts all the way to the restaurant to talk to Yeet Man, and it just kind of escalates from there into the incident with the cops or whatever. But I thought it was a good like kind of like intro, you know what I mean, to what's going on in these multiple schools or whatever. And then later on, I thought it was even interesting that you kind of see what I call kind of Kung Fu Alley, where there's all these different schools in this kind of like narrow frame of space, and it's just like four or five schools with all these different like looks and like different uniforms, and I thought it really looked cool, like that whole like, aspect of like different schools at the same location fighting with each other. It's almost like that joke about going to a Starbucks across the street and then going to the other Starbucks across the street. You know what I mean? And you see like multiple pizza places at the same location. That's kind of what it reminds me of, and this competition within it. So once one dude is worried that his reputation is gone, that's a big thing because one school could be completely gone from the whole thing in that one moment.
For sure. So then what happens is they refer to it as the Second Sino-Japanese War. For those, you could basically call it part of the World War II theater. Yip and his family are forced to move into a really horrific-looking apartment. The Imperial Japanese Army confiscates their house for use as a military headquarters. We don't really see that. That is very much explained in the text. They kind of go out of their way to not humiliate Ip Man and make him look bad. So I think that's, of course, really interesting and kind of part of the nationalistic fervor of this film. So we get Yip getting a job at a coal mine in 1938. But of course, the child does not age. The kid should be like 8 or 9 at this point, and they're not. We are introduced to a couple of Japanese characters. One is General Mayura, a Japanese karate master. He sets up an arena where Chinese martial artists can challenge his military trainees for a bag of rice. Former police officer Li Zhao is an interpreter for the Japanese, and that is something that we will see next week as well. We have a kind of the interpreter / traitor who eventually comes back into the fold and realizes his loyalty for China. But in this case, he is visiting the mine to recruit anyone willing to fight. Yip declines to participate, but eventually agrees to go when Lin, the brother of Yuan, he does not return from a match. And again, the fighting scenes with the Japanese soldiers, I think, are some of the best of the entire movie. And there is a point when we get, and again, I really do like the escalation, but I think in some ways the scene of Yip Man fighting the 10 trainees might be the best scene in the movie, especially the part when he forces a soldier into the splits and then straight up snaps his leg. That was one of the most gruesome things I've seen in a long time.
The dude was pissed. The dude was because he knows that Lin is dead. You know what I mean? Like he knows Lin is dead. We see what happens to Lin, but yeah, it's just kind of like it's really fucked up. So his anger and all that aggression, he just took it out on all of them. Because like it's not like they said, "Hey, you got to fight 10 men." He said to them, "I want to fight 10 men." So that makes it even more badass. And when that happened, I was just like, dude, he just called out 10 dudes. Like, what the fuck is going on here? And then he just demolishes them all. And he does it in such a way where it's like each person he takes down is like some kind of meticulous, well thought out way to come out. You mentioned the splits thing. There was another point where I think he took a guy down and just kind of hit his head like 10 times in a row, like really, really fast to the point where he just knocked out because, I mean, 10 blows to the head in that short amount of time, you're out. So each person he knocked out was like a different way he did it. So again, the choreography by Sammo Hung, here's the choreography, that well thought out way, almost like a wrestling match. How do you tell a story within the fighting sequence? So in this case, it's like, how do I take out 10 guys? I have to take them out each a different way. And it was just so great. And the way it looked and the way it was shot. Again, the only thing is that it was really, I don't want to say poorly lit. I think it could have been much better lit. They wanted like the dark shadows with like a white lit ring, but the ring was still dark.
Is this when you want to get into? Is this when you want to talk about the colors too? Because I think that impacts our conversation on the lights.
Yeah, because don't you think they could have filmed it a lot brighter in this case? Because it feels like they were trying to go for this darkness, and I get it because there's not a lot of I don't know if it's like an electricity thing or they wanted natural lighting, but man, I felt like that could have popped a lot more if the mat was like a bright white instead of this like saturated color, and the whole thing is saturated color. And my brother was watching it with me for a good 20 minutes when he came over, and he was telling me like, "Oh yeah, they're doing this on purpose because they wanted to make it look and feel like 1935." And I was like, "What?" And he was like, "Yeah, that kind of like saturated feel to the look of it all. You know what I mean? Especially when you go to the coal mine part, it kind of has that feel to it." And I was like, "Okay, I get it." But I felt like the colors should have popped more. Like the blacks didn't look black; they looked very like, when you turn the contrast up, kind of thing. And I was like, I don't know why they're doing that, because the scenes would have popped more if they did that. But I don't know what the artistic decision was behind that.
For sure. And so we get Yip seeing Lou being shot in the back of the head by Mayura's sadistic deputy. And I think the interesting thing is, like, with all of these movies, and I feel like this is an American thing too, like, Mayura clearly has some level of honor. Like, yes, he is portrayed to be an antagonist and a villain, but, like, he has a certain amount of honor, but he's got a sadistic deputy named Colonel Sato. He is the one that is just a complete asshole. And I think one of the other thematic elements of this movie that I really appreciate is the way the guns are treated in this movie. Guns are treated as the ultimate sign of dishonor. Like, if you use a gun, you're just the worst person in the world. And that is something that I have a tremendous amount of respect for. Again, it very much contrasts to the way that we treat guns here in this country. And look, as much as I love a lot of these action franchises, and I'm specifically looking at you, John Wick, there is a certain fetishizing of guns that does bother me, especially with all the gun incidents that we have in this country. So I think that's an underrated element of this movie. Like, if people talk about this movie, they're going to talk about the action scenes, they're going to talk about how nationalistic it is, but I think the gun conversation, I think, is a really interesting one too.
Yeah, and I think that's because of the contrast in our society. Because of course, with our film history, the film industry grew up with westerns being a predominant part of that early part, and of course, the guns and westerns and all that kind of thing, and the visual you have with a John Wayne or a Clint Eastwood. It's very much in the culture, you know what I mean? So I think that's part of it. So maybe there's a little like subconscious, reasoning to why a lot of people, are so-called gun nuts. Maybe it's just some kind of like, the way the Chinese people see Yeet Man as this folk cultural hero. A lot of people in our country, in the U.S., see John Wayne as like a folk cultural hero, even though he's an actor. You know what I mean? So if you take that kind of perspective and his love for guns, of course it's going to translate to the people that he influences. So I can kind of see that connection there. I've always kind of seen that connection when it comes to like westerns. Even I love westerns, but I do have got one of my fears is like a fear of guns. Like, I don't ever want to like go to a shooting range. You know what I mean? I know that sounds weird, but I never want to fire a gun in my life. So, and I've never fired a gun in my life. All I fired was like an NES gun or like a video game kind of gun, and that's it. You know what I mean? So that's kind of one of my fears in life is like a gun. And I guess it's because from movies and stuff like that, but just from real life incidents that if you read on the news, it's kind of like you got to be prepared. So that's kind of one of my fears. So incorporating that in this movie, I thought it was an interesting thing. Because like in Western movies, it's all about the ultimate dishonor, shooting a man in the back, and there's a whole movie about that. If you want to check it out, the best one is probably Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford with Brad Pitt. Excellent movie, really well done about that subject. But it's kind of close to this subject about using a gun is very dishonorable, especially in a culture where they really want to. It's all about a lot of these different martial arts, coming together and finding out who's the best. Using your hands kind of thing. It's that whole Friday discussion. You know what I mean? So that Friday discussion really is like not a joke. You know what I mean? I think that kind of translates to a lot of different cultures about using your fists as opposed to using a gun. So it's not surprising that in this movie that they really emphasize that, especially about a movie about martial arts.
So because of the way that Ip Man defeats these 10 soldiers, General Mayor becomes very interested in perhaps using his skill set. I didn't talk about this earlier, but Jin Shanzhao, he is somebody that we saw kind of at the beginning of the movie, kind of a skilled northern Chinese martial arts master. He defeated all of the masters in Foshan. I think it's a great sequence because it's literally like professional wrestling when they bring a big heel to the territory and he kind of goes through the jobbers and he kind of moves his way up the card and then eventually he gets to the main eventer. And in this case, Yip Man pretty much kicked his ass. Now Shanzhao is leading a bandit gang harassing workers at a cotton mill run by Yip's friend Chao Chun. And Ip agrees to train the workers in Wing Chun for self-defense. I know you really like that sequence, and I'll let you talk about that. So the workers are able to stall the gang when they return long enough for Yip to arrive and defeat both Jin and Yuan, who are part of the gang. And after running them out of the village, Yip confronts Juan and gives him a small tin that belonged to Lin after informing him of his brother's death. And Brian, Yuan opens the tin, finds the kite inside, and this motivates Yuan to leave the gang. I know you really love this part of the movie.
Yeah, so let's start with the training montage. Okay, everyone loves a good training montage, the Rocky training montages and stuff like that. But when it's a whole community of people coming together, God, it's great because it does remind me of Seven Samurai, where the Seven Samurai not only had to come together and fight, but they also trained the villagers to fight for themselves. And that comes up with the Magnificent Seven, it's kind of like a trope at this point to teach the people to defend themselves as opposed to just bringing someone in. You saw that in Bug's Life, for crying out loud. You know what I mean? And it works, that whole idea, and it kind of comes from that idea of that starving person, teach a starving person how to fish, and then they'll be fed for life as opposed to giving them a fish for one day. You know what I mean? So I love that concept, and I love how they applied it here. And they were defending themselves, and they were like, at first they were just kind of like, oh shit, I just got punched in the face by the bad guys, and they were getting punched in the face, and they just kind of held their ground and stuck with the technique. You know what I mean? And they stuck with it, man. Trust the system or whatever it is, what do you want to call it? Trust the process, I think they call it in the NBA. But yeah, I loved the whole sequence, and the music was playing, and it was really great. And then, I'm a fan of callbacks in movies. It's a sign of good writing when you can introduce this random event in the beginning of a movie. You think nothing of the kite. You think it's just some random event to get the person there to kind of view the fight at the beginning. But it turns out it becomes like a full, full arc later on, and it influences a character to make a big character decision later on in the movie. And I thought that was really great. So there was a lot of good, it may have been kind of off-putting to have these events at the beginning of the movie, and then all of a sudden it switches to the occupation, which kind of threw me off. But then once these two scenes happen, where the bad guy comes back for the first act, and then the kite thing, it was like, okay, we got full circles happening, and then things are starting to click, and then all of a sudden it builds to the last act, I think quite nicely, where it's the big showdown with the karate master.
Yeah, so eventually it gets to the point where Mayura wants to really fight Yip Man or use Yip Man to fight and to train the soldiers in the ways of Chinese martial arts. So in the end, that's Yip Man kind of sends his family away or tries to send them away and decides that he needs to defend the honor of Chinese martial arts. He does not want to train these Japanese soldiers. And even though Sato wants to execute him, of course, Mayura has some level of honor, accepts the challenge, wants to crush the Chinese spirit with this behavior. And Sato threatens Yip with death if he does not allow the general to win. The people of the town are watching, and Yip Man defeats Mayura after a long and hard fight. Again, I mean, the way they built to this is so great, and it's very strong. It's a great action sequence, and eventually his wife and son do show up just in the nick of time. That is when Yip is shot in the shoulder by Sato. The crowd overwhelms the Japanese soldiers. Lee manages to kill Sato with his own gun. In a great bit of irony, again, coming back to the way the guns are treated. Yip is taken away amid the chaos, manages to escape with his family to Hong Kong. A closing montage of captions reveals that Yip spent the rest of his life working to spread the teachings of Wing Chun, establishing a school and training several students, including Bruce Lee, kind of giving away what's going to be coming up in the sequels, I guess. But a very solid ending to the movie, I would say.
So this felt like they were just thinking, like, if we can't get any sequels done, and this is just a one-off, we gotta put all this information at the end just in case we don't get that sequel. So that's kind of the vibe I'm getting, because we get that in some movies too, where like they give us a big ending, and then you feel like, okay, that's it, and then all of a sudden, there's sequels because they thought they wouldn't have a sequel to it, aka like a Halloween or something like that. You know what I mean? So that's the vibe I was getting. So it's fine, because if you just watch this movie and don't want to watch the sequels, it works on its own in that case. So I think that works for this movie. I love the battle they had. It was just kind of like it kind of reminds you of Bloodsport a little bit because of the way the mat's set up and the way that the crowd's set up. It kind of reminded me of, like, I hate to say it, but like one of those violent soccer matches that you hear stories about the crowd going nuts. I've heard some stories, and if you want to research some stories about that referee that got killed by the crowd, look it up, man, because that's an insane story. And it kind of reminded me of that. I was like, oh my God, are they going to start decapitating these Japanese soldiers or something like that? Like, are they going to go nuts on them? And I was kind of afraid, like, oh, please don't go extreme. But they almost went to that level, but they kind of kept it, you know, passable, like a PG-13 level. And all you just see is like, eat man on the floor. Like, not only that, I mean, the bump he takes, you would think he would have broke his shoulder, because the stuntman goes like, oh, like flat on the concrete from like a 4 foot elevated platform. That's a hard bump, and he lands on his shoulder, man. So I was like, God damn, the fact that he lands on the shoulder too, that got shot, adds more insult to the injury. The other thing too is like you don't see him go to the hospital. You see him on the ride to the hospital from county to county, pretty much, or city to city, and I was like, this dude is gonna bleed out by the time he gets there. But again, that's kind of separating historical fact from the real life, because I'm pretty sure like he was shot in real life, but he didn't go from city to city nearly bleeding out. He probably got immediate medical attention. But in this case, it just made it seem like they stuck him on a truck and just drove off. So I was just like, oh wow, they left a bullet in there and everything. They didn't really think this one out. But other than that, you know what I mean? It was a fun ending. The people were cheering, and it. I don't want to say it was a squash, but it felt like one of those Brock Lesnar matches where he just goes in there, does about 70% of the work, and then the other guy does about, the other 20%, and then Brock just kicks out and then does the finish.
For sure. I also want to mention there's a pretty nasty blood spitting scene in this movie. I want to point that out. That was pretty fantastic as well.
Are you talking about when the guy gets shot or when the guy get hit in the mouth?
When he gets hit in the mouth.
Okay, yeah, because that was extreme too, the way they shot that poor Kung Fu Master getting shot in the back of the head, and then it falls in the bag of rice, and then Eat Man takes the bag of rice to the family, still covered in blood. I thought that was like a little too much, but they did it anyway.
A little too on the nose, but this is not a subtle movie at all.
Yeah, but then when the karate master gets beat up, because there's a pole in the middle of the ring that's kind of like the middle point, and it's pretty much getting a guy in the corner and just going nonstop in the guy, and then it was a mix of internal bleeding mixed with probably a broken jaw. So Yeet Man, like I said, it was not a 50-50 thing. It was very much a 70-30 where Yeet Man really kicked ass, and I was kind of surprised they went with that kind of booking, to be honest.
I mean, they certainly kept him Hulk Hogan strong, I guess you could say. So for me, look, I think this movie is very, very good. I think there's a lot of really strong elements for the most part. I love the action scenes. Specifically, I love the sound effects of the punches. I don't know. Did you appreciate that as well?
Oh yeah, because it's like it doesn't sound like the 80s or 90s way of doing it, where it sounds almost kind of fake, but it sounds real enough as if you were punching, not even a punching bag, like punching like almost like a dead like one of the meat bags from like Rocky. It sounds like legit meat that they're hitting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would say so. That's definitely true. I think Donnie Yen gives a very strong performance here. I love the way that he treats each fight differently, and just the way that he starts out. It's almost like he's not even trying, and the movements are just so rhythmic, and he's just able to do it on instinct. And then you see the intensity go up as the intensity of the fights go up. So that's also something that I really appreciated. I think this is the kind of role that I think is made for Donnie Yen.
Yeah, and I mentioned in the Wing Chun episode where Wing Chun was kind of the first time I saw him do like him smiling and kind of being happy and doing the comedy. Here's the opposite, and I was like kind of prepared for that because I was like, okay, at least Wing Chun gave me what I wanted to see in this case. Because he was just all straight up, stoic, like I mentioned before, and his performance was very, like he doesn't really break too much, you know what I mean, like doing laughing or comedy. Maybe when he's hanging out with his kids, but it's not to the level that he was in Wing Chun. So I like that contrast. We kind of got to see in back-to-back weeks, and I really appreciate his performance. And I would probably say he is the best performance in the movie. I would say that his wife, though, was, I don't know, his wife. I don't know if she's a good actress or not. I don't know if it's the role.
Oh, yeah. We really haven't talked about the family. I want to address her when we talk about the weaknesses, so we'll get to her.
Okay, yeah, because her performance threw me off. But in terms of comparing it to his, he's definitely the best performance. And I would say that, I forget his name, but the Japanese Captain Kung Fu or Japanese Karate Master. I thought he did a good job because I felt like the guy that was, the gun guy, he was a little too, on the nose. You know what I mean? Too comic-y for the movie at times, like going super evil, like out of nowhere. But I felt like the other guy was kind of like the right kind of evil, where he was kind of balancing it out and not necessarily going over the edge immediately when something happened.
Hiroyuki Aikuchi as General Mayura and Tenma Shibuya as Colonel Sato. So those are the two actors. I want to make sure I get their names in there. I apologize if I botch their names because we are talking about Japanese names. And look, years of watching Dragon Gate New Japan have certainly helped me with the pronunciation of Japanese names, but it may not be perfect. I would agree with you. I think the former's performance is definitely better than the latter's. I also want to say I appreciated showing a different side of World War II. Again, I think we are very used. I mean, look at how many Holocaust movies there are, for God's sakes. And to see this, a very different perspective, appreciated that. I mean, to me, this is just quality propaganda. I mean, let's just call it what it is. And, I think it may be kind of a backhanded compliment, but I think in terms of like promoting Chinese culture and emphasizing honor, I think it does exactly what it set out to do. And I think it does a really good job of that.
I agree. And I wasn't like offended or like pissed off by it or anything like that. I was just like, okay, this is just a country presenting its culture through a folk tale or a folk hero, told through a martial arts scope. And I was okay with that.
I mean, it's no different than most of the war movies that the United States has made, especially the pro-war movies, the John Wayne stuff. I mean, it's no different. The weaknesses. Let's talk about the family. Now, the kid, I try to not critique kid actors because I think they're kind of put in a tough spot. So I don't really want to talk about his son as much. But so the wife, it is interesting to note. So I was looking up a little bit of information on Lin Hung, who plays Yip Man's wife, Chung Wing Sing. And she was a host of Chinese Top Model. So with that understanding, you look at her IMDb and you look at her filmography, she really hasn't been in a lot of movies. So I think it would be safe to assume that perhaps acting is not her first job. Acting is perhaps not her strength. And boy, does it show in this movie. I think, especially when we talk about next week, I think there's perhaps going to be a temptation to compare her to Adrian from the Rocky movies. And in this case, she is no Talia Shire. I will say that.
It kind of scared me a little bit because I swear in the first 2/3 of the movie, she doesn't blink. And I know that sounds nuts because sometimes you don't even notice those kind of things, but for some reason I was just like, what is going on here? Where it's like a close-up on her, it's either a medium shot or a close-up, and you see her face and I just feel like something's wrong. And then I noticed she's not blinking and I was like, is she not blinking on purpose? Is something going on here? Is there something to perform? Am I tripping out? And then I noticed other people in the scenes, they're blinking. So I was like, what the fuck is going on here? She starts blinking when she starts crying at the end. You know what I mean? Which I thought was kind of, I was just like, okay, she's normal. Thank God. Why did it take so long for her to blink? But I guess that's just her. And it threw me off, I swear to God. But she started acting normal by that scene. I don't know what, I guess it's the writing, and they just don't want to focus on her, and that's kind of sad. But yeah, she's just kind of there. And it just sucks because she doesn't have an arc. She doesn't have nothing. So that's kind of one of those things where it's like, okay, we're going to focus on this, great hero, and then we're not going to really focus on the wife or his love of his life and how much that influenced his life or whatever. I mean, when it boils down to it, yes, he's doing the things he's doing for his family and working in the coal mine because they don't have the wealth anymore or whatever. So I get all that. It's just, I don't know. You could have gave her something to do, like at least for 5 minutes, because something, you know what I mean? But all she does is like she kind of runs away, thinking that it's best that they leave town because they tell her to leave town, and then she comes back for some reason, which I think was, I don't know, a very unsafe decision, but she still came back.
That she did, and we will be talking more about her next week. We've addressed the washed out colors. Again, the movie is very clearly designed to look like it took place in World War II, but I wish there was perhaps a little bit more vibrancy to what was going on. This movie spoils future movies in many ways, and I guess life. And the timeline, there are timeline issues in the next movie that are much more profound, but they also exist here as well. Brian, any other weaknesses you want to bring up? Again, I think the weaknesses are pretty minor. I do think this movie is very, very good. I would give this a very solid 8 out of 10.
I give it a 7.5. I forgot one strength I want to mention. I love the Eat Man theme. The Eat Man theme is so like it's subtle, but it gets the job done and it's kind of inspiring. So, and they bring it back for the second movie, and I hope they bring it back for the third and fourth. That we haven't watched those yet in terms of the recording, but or as of the time of this recording. But yeah, I really love the theme. Overall, a 7.5. The colors just really, really bother me, man, and that sucks because I'm a guy that really loves a good set design. I feel like the sets were good. It's just they didn't fucking brighten them up. You know what I mean? So, and I love the design of what I call Kung Fu Alley. Just all these different schools next to each other, all competing in this same narrow frame of space. So I thought that was a great visual that I wish they kind of added more color to, because I felt like in a different world, with a different cinematographer, it would have looked like the Warriors or something like that. You know what I mean? Where it's got the different looks of each school, and they almost had it 100, like they almost had it A+ level. I would say it was a B+, but still the idea was a great idea.
For sure. For me, the MVP is director Wilson Yip. You mentioned, again, I think all four of these movies, I think our MVP and the best performance are going to be the same. I think it's going to be Wilson Yip as the MVP, Donnie Yen as the best performance. And I think the only way we should mention that is if it's something different for the other three movies, because I think this is pretty much how it's going to be. And quite frankly, that's probably how it should be.
I'm going to go a little different. Because, yeah, I think the MVP is Sammo Hung. I think the fight sequences in this are so incredibly well done. And you mentioned the escalation. And that all comes from his booking. This is like praising Pat Patterson as the true creative genius of the 80s and 90s of the WWF as opposed to Vince. And I'm kind of more in the Pat Patterson camp because I feel like he did more creatively in the long run. Like good things in the long run, like booking the Rumble and what that does. In this case, I feel like it's Sammo Hung doing a lot of the work in this movie and making those awesome moments in the fight sequences matter the most. So I'm going with Sammo Hung. Best performance, Donnie Yen. We'll see, because Sammo Hung is not the fight choreographer on 3 and 4. So we'll see how that feels. But as of right now, Sammo Hung's presence in these movies are very, very well felt.
Very interesting. I certainly think you can make the argument Sammo Hung had a huge influence over this movie, and that is perfectly reasonable. But again, I always default to the director in situations like these. But certainly, giving Sammo Hung the credit, I think is worth it. And of course, next week we are going to be discussing Yip Man 2. But Brian, I do have to say that some of the recent events of the Academy Awards have been influencing us, and in this month we'll be taking a look at Yip Man. We are going to do a bonus because there are 5 Tuesdays in May, Brian. We are going to be doing a bonus Michelle Yeoh episode at the end of the month, and I know that you are very excited for the rest of the year. I mean, we've got some preliminary plans that I think are very, very exciting.
Yeah, so I don't want to spoil too much or reveal some of the movies, but we're going to do a Harrison Ford month, and it's exciting. It's going to be, I believe, June is when we set that up. July is interesting because originally what we had scheduled was we're going to kind of go ranking some of our favorite franchises, the movies within the franchises. I think we might save that for a later date because Brendan Fraser won the Oscar, and I feel like it's kind of like appropriate to kind of honor some of his summer blockbusters, plus some of his movies that I watched on summer vacation as a kid, like Airheads. I watched that a lot on TV on summer vacations. It was just on TV a lot. So I think, spoiler alert, one of us is going to be Airheads. We're not going to reveal the rest, but we're going to have a Brendan Fraser month in June as well. Or, July, actually.
July. Harrison Ford, in honor of the final Indiana Jones movie, we are going to be taking a look at Harrison Ford movies, none of which will be Indiana Jones, but we are going to be kind of looking at maybe some of his underrated movies that he's done. I am so excited for Brian to see the movie Presumed Innocent. That's all I'm going to say.
Well, I haven't watched Witness in a while, and I remember watching Witness on Showtime at midnight when I was 12 years old and just being engrossed by it and the suspense by it, but I can't remember the details, but all I remember is being so engrossed by the suspense. So I can't wait for that one. Witness is another one. Down the line, August is kind of open. We'll discuss that later. But Creature Feature Month is coming. We haven't finalized the movies, but I know one of them is going to be Alligator for sure because that gives us the chance to kind of honor Robert Forrester, and I'm going to host that month as well. And then October is going to be interesting because we haven't really discussed this, but we're going to discuss it now on air. But there's 5 Tuesdays in October, and we are bringing back the whole underrated sequels thing, but we're doing underrated horror sequels. So I think October 31st is going to be a special episode because that's the last Tuesday of the month. It's Halloween. We might probably end up doing a double feature debate maybe on a certain franchise. Maybe have a certain franchise where we like one movie in the franchise that the other doesn't. I think we've set that up for Scream, maybe. I don't know, but I think that's the perfect opportunity to do it. And of course, later on, we'll have some holiday stuff maybe, and some things might change, but later on. But I think this year is going to be fun.
So I believe we might do our franchise thing in August, and November, I believe we are setting up to do underrated Disney sequel month as well. So that I'm very, very much looking forward to kind of doing underrated sequels a couple of other times in specific genres. I think we decided that there were enough underrated sequels in other spaces that we can not only dedicate more time to them, but kind of get into like horror or Disney. And I think Disney is appropriate because there's always a big Disney release around Thanksgiving. So I think that really works out. And December, I think we are considering the possibility of either a holiday or possibly doing something for Bruce Willis. That has to be determined, though. We haven't quite figured out December yet, but I am very, very excited to do this with Brian for the rest of the year. And all I could say is, Brian, based on Ant-Man Quantumania and the most recent Shazam, I am really glad that we're not doing superhero stuff for a while. That's all I'm going to say.
Except for the Heroic Trio sequel, which is technically a superhero movie still.
Correct, yes.
But
yes,
other
yes,
than that, I get what you're saying. Hey, I love Ant-Man and the Wasp sequel. I was really into it.
Well, you're crazy.
I love the
you're
visuals. It's my style. And I was like, oh, visuals. Yeah, man. And I was probably a little stoned for it. But still, it was visually awesome. But that's all I'll discuss about that. I, to this day, have yet to see Shazam, and I will never see Shazam 2 probably because I have zero interest in it. All I heard was Wonder Woman is in it. That's it.
I just want to say I asked Brian if I could spoil it, and he said yes. So that shows you the level of interest. So Brian knows what happened because I told him, but he boy does he not care.
Boy, do I not care. Do not care at all. So yeah, there you go. Let's kind of get away from superhero movies this year and kind of focus on these other movies from different genres. I think it's fun. I mean, a lot of these movies, I've seen, but a bunch Jerome hasn't seen, and I can't wait for Creature Feature Month because I think every movie he's never seen except maybe one movie. Except I think I'm going to call an audible, and we'll discuss that off air.
Yeah, Shin Godzilla is one of my requests for Creature Feature. So as long as that is being honored, then I will go with Creature Feature Month. So that is being honored. So that is what we are doing.
I can't wait for that one. Can't wait for that one.
All right. So for Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening. We will be back again next week to talk about Yip Man 2, or is it a remake of another movie from the 1980s?
Listen, Yeet Man's cool and all, but I think smoking a cigarette before a fight is not the exact message you want to send to kids.